The air inside the D.C. Public Policy Symposium was already tense before Tom Homan stepped onto the stage. The room buzzed with anticipation as former high-ranking immigration officials, federal judges, and political commentators took their seats. But the real reason half the audience showed up wasn't for policy talk. It was to witness the brewing animosity between Tom Homan and Judge James Boasberg finally boil over. Whispers about their private disagreements had been floating around for weeks. Their ideologies clashed like thunder and steel, and now, under the spotlight, there was no script to hold them back. Boasberg, dressed in his usual air of quiet arrogance, had already spoken. His address had veered into territory that many in the room knew would ignite Homan, blaming former immigration policies for societal division, systemic cruelty, and even accusing certain former officials of personal bias in enforcing the law. He didn't name names, but everyone knew who he was aiming at. His words dripped with insinuation. Homan sat quietly in the front row, jaw tight, fists clenched just under the table. The moment he was called to the podium, it was no longer a discussion. It was war. He didn't bother with greetings or formalities. His voice cut through the auditorium like a knife, laying out statistic after statistic, not to educate, but to destroy. He dismantled Boasberg's arguments with a brutal efficiency, weaving in real-life cases and painting the consequences of Boasberg's courtroom decisions in stark, unflinching detail. Children put in danger, cartels empowered, laws twisted. But it wasn't just a counter-argument. It was personal. Every word struck like a hammer aimed squarely at Boasberg's reputation. Boasberg's face stiffened. Gone was the smug composure. He rose from his chair mid-speech and interrupted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Homan didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped down from the podium, walked toward the judge, and fired back with an icy calmness that made the confrontation even more chilling. The moderator tried to intervene, but neither man cared. They weren't arguing policy anymore. This was about honor, pride, and vengeance. What started as a panel turned into a battlefield. Boasberg accused Homan of fear-mongering, of leveraging tragedy for political gain. Homan countered with examples of Boasberg's rulings that, in his words, cost people their lives. There was no decorum. The room pulsed with discomfort and morbid fascination. Every eye was fixed on the two men as their professional civility crumbled into raw, bitter hostility. Then came the moment that cracked the walls. Homan pulled out a folder, thick and marked, one he had held back for months. Inside were transcripts, memos, and redacted testimonies that linked Boasberg to a series of closed-door meetings with non-profit groups under federal investigation. The connection was murky, but it was enough. Enough to cast doubt. Enough to suggest corruption. Gasps spread across the room like wildfire. Boasberg's eyes narrowed, his voice now brittle with rage. He accused Homan of fabrication, of character assassination. Homan stood his ground, daring him to deny what was already spreading across the projector screen behind them. Boasberg's name was plastered alongside documentation no one in that room had ever seen. Security edged closer. Event staff whispered frantically into headsets. Boasberg, red-faced and breathing hard, turned toward one of the aides and instructed them to call the police. Not because he was in danger, but because he wanted Homan removed. It was a power move, a desperate grasp at control slipping through his fingers. But Homan didn't budge. He crossed his arms and stared the judge down as though daring the cops to come. His voice, calm yet electrified with defiance, resonated through the room. He told them all what no one else had the spine to say, that no robe, no title, no polished reputation could hide what the truth was about to uncover. The room had transformed. It was no longer a symposium. It was an exposé. Cameras rolled, phones streamed live, and in that frozen moment of chaos, two legacies collided in a blaze of fury and truth. Homan had drawn blood, and Boasberg had shown the world just how rattled he could get when someone challenged his untouchable status. The police arrived within minutes, two officers moving quickly through the crowd with blank expressions that betrayed no allegiance. The moderator stepped in, trying to explain the situation with words that only sounded more absurd with each breath. This wasn't a criminal event, not in the traditional sense. But the moment they reached the stage, Judge Boasberg demanded immediate action. He pointed at Homan as if expecting obedience, but the officers hesitated. This wasn't a man shouting in a parking lot. This was Tom Homan, someone they recognized, someone they respected. One of them subtly shook his head. They weren't going to be pawns in a grudge match. The hesitation was all it took. Boasberg realized, in front of the cameras, the officials, the world, that his grip on the room had slipped. He turned to the crowd, trying to salvage his image, declaring Homan's actions as defamatory, illegal, dangerous. But it only made him sound desperate. Meanwhile, Homan didn't say a word. He stood still, stoic, the folder now in the hands of a senior journalist who had already begun photographing the contents. The crowd wasn't erupting. It was simmering. They didn't clap, they didn't boo. They watched. And in that quiet tension, Homan walked off the stage with a calm that was far more threatening than fury. He didn't need security. He didn't need a microphone. He had already won that round by exposing something no one expected. Judge Boasberg had spent years cloaked in authority, but now the fabric had torn. The courtroom wasn't his shield anymore. The aftermath spread like wildfire. Within an hour, political analysts were dissecting the footage on news panels. The documents Homan released were authenticated by sources who had remained silent for years, fearing retaliation. Not all of them proved wrongdoing, but they proved access, proximity, and a disturbing pattern. Boasberg had ruled on cases where affiliated groups had private meetings with him weeks prior. It was enough to raise eyebrows in every direction. At the event, Boasberg stormed into a private room, slamming the door behind him. His advisors followed, pale and speechless. He wasn't just angry. He was cornered. For a man who prided himself on precision and control, the unpredictability of Homan's ambush was humiliating, and the fact that no one leapt to defend him, not even his colleagues, cut deeper than any allegation. His calls to federal contacts went unanswered. No favors were coming. The silence on the other end of those lines was louder than anything Homan had said. Homan, meanwhile, sat quietly in the media lounge, sipping water, giving no interviews. He didn't need to. Every outlet was already crafting their narrative, and in every version, he was the one who shattered the illusion. He wasn't playing the political game. He was dismantling it piece by piece. When one young reporter dared to ask him what his end goal was, he simply leaned in and whispered something no one else heard. But the expression on the reporter's face told the story. It wasn't just about the judge. This was part of something bigger. By evening, Boasberg's office issued a brief, stiff statement denying all accusations and calling Homan's presentation an orchestrated smear campaign. But it was too late. The footage had gone viral. The documents were under investigation, and internal judicial reviews had been requested by independent ethics committees. The tide was no longer under his control, and then came the real blow. A whistleblower emerged. A former clerk who had worked under Boasberg years ago sent a detailed letter to multiple news outlets, corroborating the timeline of meetings and suggesting that certain groups had indeed pushed to influence judicial outcomes. The clerk admitted shame and fear, but said Homan's actions gave her the courage to speak. The letter alone sent legal circles into panic mode. Suddenly, Boasberg's anger turned to fear. He paced his office, snapping at aides, threatening lawsuits, and calling for emergency damage control. But the walls were already cracking, and the foundation beneath him no longer felt solid. He demanded a private meeting with Homan. Not in front of cameras. Not on a stage, behind closed doors. Alone. And to everyone's shock, Homan agreed. The meeting was scheduled for late evening in a small secured chamber inside the symposium building. No press, no staff, no distractions. Just Tom Homan and Judge Boasberg, locked in a room where history had already begun to turn. Outside reporters swarmed the exits and officials pretended to be busy, while quietly eavesdropping from behind corners. But inside, the air was colder, heavier. The door clicked shut, and the silence wrapped around them like a shroud. Boasberg didn't waste time. He was already pacing, every gesture sharp, agitated, like a man whose empire had been shaken by one stone. His anger hadn't faded. It had festered. But what truly haunted him wasn't the humiliation. It was the fact that Homan had played his hand without warning, and played it better than anyone expected. Boasberg demanded to know where the documents had come from, who else knew, and what. Homan wanted in exchange for silence. But Tom didn't come to bargain. He came to deliver a final message. He calmly explained that this wasn't about revenge or politics. It was about accountability. Homan had spent years watching institutions protect their own, watching justice contort itself around personalities and power. And Boasberg, in his arrogance, had become the embodiment of that system. A man so convinced of his own virtue that he forgot to fear consequences. The judge laughed, not with humor but disbelief. He couldn't accept that Homan would do this, for principle. No one did anything just for the truth, not in his world. But when he looked into Homan's eyes, he saw no appetite for leverage, no gloating triumph. Just clarity. That was what scared him most, because it meant there would be no deals, no cover-ups, only fallout. Boasberg's tone turned darker. He began to threaten. He hinted at classified files, closed investigations, mutual connections that could be dredged up to smear Homan in return. He reminded him of enemies in high places. But the threats sounded hollow now. The same room where he once would have commanded fear now echoed with his irrelevance. And Homan didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out a second envelope, one not shared with the press, one that had never left his possession. Inside were 2 memos, each signed by Boasberg, from a time when he claimed to be uninvolved with the organizations now under scrutiny. They weren't criminal, but they were damning. Proof that Boasberg had knowingly concealed his interactions. Enough to unravel any credibility he still clung to. Boasberg's face turned pale. This time he said nothing. The silence between them now wasn't tense. It was final. When the door finally opened, both men walked out in opposite directions without a word. The staff waiting nearby tried to read their expressions, but it was clear who had come out ahead. Homan walked with calm, with certainty. Boasberg moved like a man who had glimpsed the beginning of his own downfall. The next morning, news outlets exploded with new leaks. Journalists who had previously ignored Homan's claims were now digging through case archives, re-evaluating Boasberg's rulings. Senators demanded an inquiry. Public pressure swelled, and for the first time in his career, Boasberg found himself the subject of headlines he couldn't control. Colleagues distanced themselves. Events he was scheduled to speak at were quietly canceled. And then came the inevitable. A formal investigation launched by the Office of Judicial Conduct, citing possible ethical breaches based on new evidence and the whistleblower's testimony. Boasberg went silent. Meanwhile, Tom Homan didn't hold a victory rally, didn't call a press conference, didn't bask in the chaos. He returned to his quiet routine, visiting field agents, speaking with families affected by border policy, and continuing the work that had always driven him. But something had changed. He had proven that no title was immune to exposure, no judge beyond reach. And people noticed. 3 weeks after the confrontation, the investigation into Judge Boasberg escalated with a speed that stunned even the most seasoned observers. Quiet whispers turned into televised interrogations and old files long buried in bureaucratic archives. were now being pored over by independent legal analysts. Boasberg, once considered a model of impartiality, was now referred to in headlines alongside phrases like conflict of interest, ethical misconduct, and judicial compromise. It was no longer a debate, it was a reckoning. Boasberg attempted to project control from behind his office door. He released carefully worded statements, hired top-tier attorneys, and scheduled an exclusive interview with a sympathetic network. But none of it worked. Every appearance made him look more like a man trying to script his own absolution. The court of public opinion was already delivering its verdict, and it was merciless. Then came the subpoena. The Senate Judiciary Committee, pressured by bipartisan outrage, summoned Boasberg to a public hearing. It was the first time in decades that a judge of his rank had been forced to explain himself under oath in such a setting. The hearing was aired live, cameras capturing every twitch of discomfort, as Boasberg was grilled about undisclosed meetings, personal relationships with advocacy groups, and selective rulings that lined up too perfectly with private agendas. Homan sat in the audience that day, not as a witness, but as a presence. He said nothing, but his very attendance sent a message. Boasberg's eyes flicked toward him once, but he quickly looked away. There was no counterattack left, no denial that would erase the facts laid out on the table. The documentation had spoken. The whistleblower had spoken. And now, the system that once protected Boasberg was turning inward to purge itself. The final blow came when the committee revealed internal emails uncovered through a private investigation. In those messages, Boasberg had discussed legal outcomes with individuals tied to active litigation, casually referencing decisions before they were made public. The emails didn't just raise questions, they answered them. Boasberg's expression collapsed in real time. His legal team froze. The room shifted from tension to a quiet, devastating finality. The only words left were those of the chairwoman, who declared that a formal recommendation for disciplinary action and possible removal from the bench would follow. It was over. As Boasberg exited the chamber, flashes from cameras blinded his path. Reporters shouted his name, asking if he would resign, if he regretted what he had done. But there was no answer. Just a shell of a man walking away from a legacy that had crumbled in public view. Homan, still seated, exhaled slowly. Not with satisfaction, but with resolve. He hadn't dismantled Boasberg for applause or revenge. He did it because someone had to. Because silence was complicity. Because justice couldn't be reserved for the courtroom alone. Later that evening, Homan released a quiet statement. Not to the media, but on a personal blog he rarely used. He wrote about the weight of watching powerful people misuse their authority and the courage it took to challenge them when no one else would. He didn't name Boasberg once. He didn't have to. The story had already been told, and the truth had already landed. Across the country, citizens, lawyers, and even former judges began discussing what this meant for the system as a whole. The fallout triggered a larger review of federal judicial accountability, and for once, reform wasn't just a talking point. It was in motion. Homan returned to work as if nothing had changed, but those who had watched the saga unfold knew otherwise. He had done something rare, something dangerous. He had looked a judge in the eye, stripped away the illusion, and reminded a nation that the law is not immune to corruption, but it is still capable of correction. And as Boasberg disappeared into obscurity, the message echoed louder than any gavel ever could. No one, not even a judge, is above the truth.